Madam Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 533 as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 533, a bill to amend the Tibetan Policy Act of 2002 to modify certain provisions of that act.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Kim, and the gentlewoman from North Carolina, Ms. Manning, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from California.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and to include extraneous material on this measure.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I rise in strong support of H.R. 533, promoting a resolution to the Tibet-China Dispute Act. This year marks the 65th anniversary of the exile of the Dalai Lama. The Tibetan people have suffered 70 years of Chinese Communist Party oppression and control. From forced labor to forced sterilization to arbitrary detention to the banning of Tibetan education, religious practices, and language, the CCP will not stop until it has erased Tibetan culture. Last year, the CCP released a white paper on its policies in Tibet. In that document, the party doubles down on its oppression and cracks down on the religious and economic freedom of Tibetans. That is why I'm a proud co-sponsor of this bipartisan bill introduced by the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. McGovern, and the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. McCall. The CCP has refused to speak with the Tibetan central authorities since 2010, essentially putting the future of Tibet and the safety of millions of Tibetans at suspended risk. This bill helps Tibetans in 2 main ways. First, it pushes back against CCP propaganda about the history of Tibet. It is simply not true that Tibet has been, as the CCP claims, end quote, a part of China since ancient times, end quote. And U.S. policy has never accepted that false claim. For that reason, this legislation clarifies U.S. policy, highlights the unique language, religion, and culture of the Tibetan people, and directs U.S. diplomats to push back against CCP propaganda. Second, this bill ensures that Tibetans have a say in their own future. It stresses the need for a direct dialogue between the CCP and the democratically elected leaders of Tibet, and that any resolution must be peaceful and include the voice of the Tibetan people. Tibetans are democracy-loving people who wish to freely practice their religion and have their distinct identity acknowledged and respected. I'm proud to play a small part in supporting this dream for the Tibetan people. So I urge all of my colleagues to help push back against the Chinese Communist Party's crackdown against the Tibetan people by voting in favor of this bill. I strongly support H.R. 533 and reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman reserves her time. The gentlewoman from North Carolina is now recognized.
Madam Speaker, I rise in strong support of H.R. 533, promoting a resolution to the Tibet-China Dispute Act as amended, and I yield myself as much time as I may consume. I want to thank Representative Jim McGovern and Representative Mike McCall for introducing this bill and working with Ranking Member Meeks to pass it out of the House Foreign Affairs Committee and bring it to the House floor today. Representative McGovern is a champion of human rights, and with this bill, he is asking all of us to stand up for the people of Tibet. I also want to thank Speaker Emeritus Nancy Pelosi for her tireless work in holding the People's Republic of China responsible for its human rights violations and her longtime advocacy for the Tibetan people. In recent years, Beijing has tightened its repressive grip over the Tibetan areas in China and attempted to dilute the distinct religious, cultural, linguistic, and historical identity of the Tibetan people. Since 2010, Beijing has also refused to meet its international obligations to engage the Dalai Lama and his representatives to resolve the Tibet issue through dialogue. At the same time, Beijing has unleashed a disinformation campaign to mislead the world about Tibet and its history. For this reason, we must pass H.R. 533, which calls the PRC out for its repression and its unwillingness to engage the Tibetan people. H.R. 533 highlights the need to preserve Tibetan identity, language, and culture, and calls on the State Department to counter PRC disinformation efforts to undermine the aspirations of the Tibetan people. H.R. 533 also calls on Beijing to live up to its commitments to engage in a genuine dialogue with Tibetan representatives to reach a negotiated resolution on the question of Tibet. By passing this timely bill, the People's House would be standing up for the universal rights and aspirations of the Tibetan people. So I encourage my colleagues to join me in supporting this measure, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman from North Carolina reserves. The gentlewoman from California is recognized.
I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Smith, who is also chairman of the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Global Health, Global Human Rights, and International Organizations.
The gentleman is
very good friend,
recognized.
the chairwoman, for yielding. Madam Speaker, I speak in strong support of H.R. 533, which would amend the Tibetan Policy Act of 2002. This bill was introduced by Congressman Jim McGovern, House Ranking Member on the Congressional Executive Commission on China, which I chair, along with Chairman McCall. And I'm proud to be listed among the many co-sponsors. Tibet and the Tibetan people face new and ever-worsening challenges from the Chinese Communist Party's repressive rule. After decades of unspeakable cruelty by the Chinese Communist Party against Tibetans, we're seeing an increase that's occurring and an effort that looks just like genocide. Threats to Tibetan linguistic, religious, and cultural heritage have expanded exponentially in recent years, and now an estimated 80% of all children in the Tibet Autonomous Region are separated from their families and educated in a massive system of colonial boarding schools, separating from parents and indoctrinating and brainwashing them each and every day. In recent years, Chinese police in Tibet have conducted mass DNA collection and iris scanning programs in wide swaths of Tibetan society, including in monasteries and primary schools. A sinister endeavor to harvest biometric data, and one which implicated an American company, Thermo Fisher Scientific, while thanks to pressure from many, including our commission, Thermo Fisher has announced it will cease cooperation in this area, though they still do business in China, and that is problematic. We need to drive home the message to American businesses: stop cooperating with a brutal regime and stop subsidizing tyranny. Amid these threats to Tibetans in Tibet, the Chinese Communist Party also seeks to extend its repressive reach abroad, targeting for surveillance and harassment Tibetan diaspora communities in the United States, in India, and in Nepal. The Chinese Communist Party is long engaged in crimes against humanity in Tibet and against Tibetans, plain and simple. I have chaired multiple hearings with my good friend and colleague, Mr. McGovern, at the Lantos Commission and at the Congressional Executive Commission on China, including one last March of last year, where we called Preserving Tibet, Combating Cultural Erasure, Forced Assimilation, and Transnational Repression, which featured the Sikyong, the head of Tibetan's government in exile, as well as Richard Gere, who is a passionate and amazingly articulate advocate for Tibet. This bill authorizes the State Department to take actions to counter Chinese Communist propaganda directed against Tibet and its history and its institutions, and for that reason, it ought to be strongly supported. I yield back.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
I continue to reserve.
I yield 4 minutes to my friend, the gentleman from the great Commonwealth of Massachusetts, Representative Jim McGovern.
Thank you very much. I want
Is
to
recognized.
I want to thank the gentlewoman from North Carolina, the gentlewoman from California, the gentleman who just spoke from New Jersey for their support for this bill, but for their leadership on human rights in general. Madam Speaker, I rise in strong support of H.R. 533, the Promoting a Resolution to the Tibet-China Dispute Act. I want to thank my co-lead, Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman McCall and Ranking Member Meeks for their work to bring this bill to the floor today. This is important. It has been more than 60 years since the People's Republic of China forced His Holiness, the 14th Dalai Lama, into exile and took control of Tibet against the will of its people. The dispute between the Chinese and the Tibetans over Tibet's status and governance has persisted ever since, in spite of the willingness of the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan people to resolve Tibet's status and governance through dialogue. With dialogue blocked, the PRC has continued its unceasing efforts to erode Tibetan history, Tibetan language, Tibetan culture, and Tibetan religion. A few years ago, I was on a delegation with Speaker Pelosi. We went to Tibet, and we saw firsthand the PRC's repression against the people of Tibet, essentially trying to erase the Tibetans as a people. This bill that we are discussing here today seeks to end that by explicitly recognizing that the Tibetan people are a people with a distinct religious, cultural, linguistic, and historical identity, by reminding all concerned that peoples, and not least the Tibetan people, have a right to self-determination under international human rights law, and by requiring the U.S. government to actively counter the PRC's propaganda about Tibet, like the false claim that Tibet has been part of China since ancient times, a position that the United States has never accepted, and there is no basis for such a claim. Through these measures, we hope to kickstart dialogue between Tibet and China, in keeping with longstanding U.S. policy. Madam Speaker, any one of us reading the news these days knows that the world is awash in conflict. At the heart of most, if not all, of those conflicts lies the systematic denial or violation of a people's human rights. The decades-old dispute between Tibet and China started as an armed conflict of invasion, resistance, and insurgency. In the long run, the only guarantee against the resumption of large-scale violence is for the PRC to fully respect the human rights and dignity of the Tibetan people. A vote for this bill is a vote to recognize the rights of the Tibetan people, and it is a vote to insist on resolving the dispute between Tibet and the People's Republic of China peacefully, in accordance with international law, through dialogue and without preconditions. There is still an opportunity to do this, but time is running out. And again, I urge my colleagues to support this bill because it is about standing up for human rights. It is about standing up for the Tibetan people, a people who have been repressed for far too long. And I thank all of my colleagues for their support, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman from North Carolina reserves.
Yes.
The lady from...
I reserve the right to close.
Okay. I have no further requests for time, and I'm prepared to close if the other side has no further speakers.
The gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized.
I yield myself as much time as I may consume for the purpose of closing. The people of Tibet have persevered through decades of repression. The PRC subjugates the Tibetan people, even though all they are asking for is the opportunity to live freely and safely. They simply want to be given autonomy they have been promised. They want to teach their children their language, their customs, their traditions. They want to preserve their culture, their religious identity, and their dignity as a distinct people. I urge the House to pass H.R. 533 so that we may honor the Tibetan people and make clear that Beijing's repression and unwillingness to engage in dialogue cannot stand. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields. The gentlewoman from California is recognized.
I again want to thank Mr. McGovern, Chairman McCall, and Ranking Member Mix for introducing this legislation. And I urge the passage of H.R. 533 and yield back the balance of my time.